Drops of cold rain pound against metal helmets. Underfoot, sticky mud, absorbing footsteps as if the earth itself decided to swallow the army. 30,000 Romans march single file along a narrow path among the trees. Behind, the rumble of wagons, ahead only thick fog. And just one question hangs in the air. How did the world's most disciplined army end up trapped by its own trust? Why couldn't the legions that conquered Greece and Egypt escape from a forest only a few miles long? The answer lies hidden in deception, mud, and fear. And at the very end of this story, a truth that will make you doubt the invincibility of any empire. It all began several years before this day, when a young Germanic chieftain named Arminius received Roman citizenship. He wore the armor of a Roman officer and spoke their language. Such people were called auxiliaries, allied warriors from conquered tribes serving Rome. Arminius was not just a soldier, he was a student of Roman tactics. And it was precisely this knowledge that became his weapon. According to the historian Tacitus, the Romans considered Germania a savage land. Emperor Augustus wanted to turn it into another province. To command the expedition, they appointed Publius Quinctilius Varus, an experienced politician but not a field commander. Varus was accustomed to administration, not to swamps and storms. His forces, 3 full legions, approximately 20,000 heavily armed infantry, and 10,000 servants, engineers and allies, each legionary carried more than 30 kilograms of equipment, shield, sword, javelin, armor, and provisions for several days. These were professionals, warriors capable of building bridges, roads, camps. Their combat formation, called the tortoise, was known as testudo, a tight formation where shields locked into a solid shell. But in the narrow thicket of the forest, under pouring rain, the testudo lost its meaning. Here it was impossible to regroup, raise standards, give signals. The forest stripped Rome of its main weapon, order. Arminius knew this. He grew up among the trees, where every trunk was cover and every path a trap. Having become Varus's trusted advisor, he reported a false rebellion of tribes far to the north. Varus believed him. After all, Arminius was a friend, an ally, a Roman. Thus began the march into the Teutoburg forest, a dense thicket where there were no roads, no vantage points, only rain, clay, and roots. When the column stretched for many kilometers, the Germans were already preparing their ambushes. They knew where the wagons would stop, where the troops would slow down, where the ground underfoot would become a quagmire. Arminius's warriors hid behind trees, camouflaging themselves with moss and mud. These were not legionaries but hunters, accustomed to moving silently. Their light spears, frames, pierced armor where swords couldn't reach. Historians wrote that on that day the sky seemed to collapse onto the earth. The thunderstorm roared, rain lashed faces, mud sucked at boots. The column slowly drowned in the quagmire when from both sides came a whistle and rumble, the Germans' first volley. The Romans didn't even have time to form up. The formation broke apart, signals were lost in the thunder. But this was only the beginning. The legionaries didn't yet know that every step forward was only deeper into the trap. Ahead of them awaited 3 days of despair, where every bush could become deaf and every cry a false signal of salvation. It was here, in the heart of the forest, that faith in Roman invincibility disappeared, step by step, under the blows of rain and spears. When Varus realized they were being attacked from everywhere, it was already too late. The legionaries, accustomed to level roads and precise signals, found themselves in chaos where the sound of the trumpet drowned in the wind and orders didn't reach even the nearest ranks. Every step required effort. Mud clung to boots, wagons got stuck, logs broke axles. The forest was not just terrain, it became an enemy, and the rain, pouring without stopping, washed away blood and hope. Tacitus wrote that the earth trembled from hoofs, but no one could run. Ahead and behind went death. On the second day, the Romans tried to fortify themselves on a hillock. This place was supposed to become a temporary camp. In such camps, legionaries spent nights during campaigns. They called them castra. Each evening, soldiers would dig a ditch, erect a palisade, arrange tents in strict order. But here, in the endless downpour, wood rotted, earth crumbled, and even fire refused to burn. Legionaries ate raw grain, drank rainwater, and prayed that dawn would bring at least some light. One of the centurions, commanders of a century, tried to gather the formation. A centurion. This is an officer who had risen from a common soldier, distinguished by discipline and personal bravery. They were the heart of the legion, an example in battle. But in the Teutoburg forest, neither bravery nor experience saved anyone. The Germans struck suddenly. Shot rushes, quick silence, another rush. The legionaries didn't see the enemy, heard only the whistle of spears and the crack of branches. Historians note that the Romans suffered not only combat, but also psychological losses. Each person felt isolated, as if in a nightmare, where there is no front line, no command, only trees and rustling. Even the standards, symbols of the legions, eagles covered in gold, now seemed useless. One of the standards fell into the mud, and legionaries rushed to save it, risking their lives. For a Roman, to lose an eagle was worse than death. It was considered a disgrace before the gods and the emperor. Arminius watched from a distance. He didn't rush into battle, didn't take risks. His strength was in calculation. According to archaeologists, the discovered remains of Germanic fortifications show that the ambushes were carefully prepared. Embankments, traps, wooden barriers. The Germans directed the enemy to where the Romans couldn't use their formations. The testudo here crumbled like clay under rain. When Varus tried to turn back, the path was already blocked. The Germans followed the column, felling trees to finally close the trap. Legionaries began discarding heavy equipment to somehow speed up movement, but this only made them defenseless. Shields became useless from moisture, swords dulled on stones and mud. With each minute, discipline dissolved, turning the army into a mob. At night, thunder and lightning flashes illuminated the bodies of the fallen. According to various estimates by historians, during the first 2 days, up to half the army perished. Those who survived trembled from cold, insect bites and fear. They still hoped that in the morning reinforcements would come, that the signal would reach the nearest camps. But Germania was divided by swamps, and not a single Roman messenger could break through the storm. On the 3rd day, the forest seemed to freeze. Silence deceived the legionaries. They thought the enemy had retreated. But behind every tree, Germans already stood. Their faces were smeared with clay to blend with the earth. They didn't shout. When the first Romans moved forward, spears flew again. This time, the blows struck the very heart of the column. Varus understood. There was no way out. Then he gave the final order. Break through at any cost. But the word cost, that day, lost its meaning. Every step forward meant death. And the farther they went, the deeper they plunged into an abyss where iron drowned in mud and courage in despair. And yet the legionaries marched, because they knew no other path but forward. And ahead, new forces of Arminius were already gathering, to finish what was started. By the morning of the 3rd day, the rain hadn't subsided but only intensified. Fog shrouded everything around. A wide veil turned the forest into an endless labyrinth where even the sound of footsteps was lost. Legionaries moved blindly, without maps, without bearings. Wet cloaks stuck to bodies, armor chafed shoulders, breath turned to vapor. They no longer looked like an army, more like shadows lost among the trees. But Varus still hoped that ahead there would be open ground, where they could form up and give battle. Somewhere beyond the fog, Arminius was giving orders to his warriors. He divided them into small detachments to surround the column. These detachments acted like hunters of large game. They didn't rush immediately but wore down their prey. The Germans had no heavy armor, but they knew every ravine, every hollow. Their strikes were short, precise and lightning fast. Legionaries tried to defend with shields, but mud pulled hands down and swords couldn't swing in the cramped space. On one of the hills, Varus ordered a halt and gathered the surviving centurions. He understood they needed to unite the remnants of the legions into a single formation, but barely had they begun to regroup when a new hail of spears crashed down from the flanks. Arminius's warriors struck at the most vulnerable, standard bearers and officers. Without commanders, legionaries lost coordination, and each minute of delay turned formation into chaos. Among the officers was Legate Numonius Valla. He was responsible for reconnaissance and supply. When it became clear the situation was hopeless, Valla attempted to lead the cavalry in a flanking maneuver to find a path to salvation. However, the Germans were already waiting for them at the swamp. The mounted Romans got stuck in the bog, where horses' hooves choked in mud. Valla and his detachment perished almost instantly. Later, archaeologists would find at this site dozens of spearheads and remains of horse harnesses, mute confirmation of the catastrophe. By midday, Arminius ordered the enemy surrounded in a tight ring. His plan resembled a hunting drive. With each minute, the Romans found themselves closer to the center, where there was neither space nor salvation. Legionaries tried to build a fortification from wagons, like a temporary fortress, but the forest didn't allow it. Trees interfered, wheels sunk in mud, as if nature itself decided to side with the Germans. One of the soldiers, having lost his helmet, leaned on his shield and looked up. The sky above him was grey, without a break. He no longer heard commands, only screams and the screech of metal. This chaos the Romans called the word furor, rage, madness, when a person fights not for victory, but simply to survive. Furor consumed everything. According to Tacitus, Varus tried to preserve the dignity of a commander. He knew that if he fell into captivity, what awaited him was not death, but disgrace. He remembered the fate of other military leaders captured by barbarians who were put on display. Therefore, when it became clear that the legions were destroyed, Varus made a choice. Together with his closest officers, he plunged his sword into his chest. This was an act of final control in a world where everything else was lost. The Germans, seeing this, didn't stop. They finished off the survivors, killed the wounded, destroyed the standards. By the evening of the third day, almost the entire army was annihilated. Only small groups managed to break through and escape, hiding in the swamps. Historians believe that of the 30,000 participants in the campaign, no more than 1,000 were saved. The rest remained here, in earth saturated with rain and blood. And above this earth, smoke was already rising. The Germans burned wagons, dismantled armor, took weapons as trophies. Arminius stood among the ashes, a man who defeated an empire, but understood that now retribution would come for him. After all, Rome didn't forgive defeats. And somewhere far away in his palaces, Emperor Augustus himself was beginning to tremble, learning that 3 legions had disappeared in a forest that no one could find on a map. News of the defeat reached Rome weeks later. When the messengers, exhausted and rugged, made it to the capital, Emperor Augustus, according to historians, couldn't believe what he heard for a long time. "Quintilius Varus, give me back my legions!" These words he repeated again and again, as if hoping that sound could return the dead. For Rome, the loss of 3 legions was not just a military catastrophe, it was a blow to the heart of the empire. From that time on, the numbers 17, 18, and 19 of the legions were never used again. They were erased from military rolls as if to banish the very memory. But while in Rome they wept, in the Teutoburg forest the killing still continued. Those who remained alive gathered in groups, trying to break through the ring of Germans. Among them were veterans with dozens of campaigns behind them, hardened warriors who had been through Gaul and Syria. Their discipline, honed by years, hadn't completely disappeared. They still tried to maintain formation, a simple column of dozens of wounded men. One of the survivors later said, "We marched not for victory, we marched to die together." In these final battles, the signalmen, Tubicens, stood out especially. They gave commands with trumpets made of bronze. Their sound was supposed to coordinate the movements of units. But in the forest, the sound of trumpets turned into chaos. Echo bounced off trees, and commands sounded as if coming from different directions. This disrupted formation, creating the illusion that the enemy was everywhere. Signalmen became the first targets of the Germans. Without them, the legions lost their hearing. Arminius didn't strive for captives. His goal was symbolic, to destroy the very faith of Romans in invulnerability. He knew that if Varus died, then news of the defeat would itself become a weapon. German warriors, after the victory, erected altars to their gods, hung armor and enemy heads on trees. For them, this was sacred retribution for years of Roman oppression. Tacitus wrote that many Germans decorated their spears with trophies, feathers from helmets and fragments of plate armor. When years later, archaeologists began excavating the battle site, they found thousands of items: arrowheads, broken swords, coins with Augustus' image, parts of shields with engraved names. All of this lay mixed with the bones of people and horses. From the structure of the finds, historians were able to determine that the battle lasted not 1 day, but at least 3 days, with short respites and constant attacks. Dead legionaries buried each other right in the mud. Bodies laid in rows, many without weapons, without footwear. Some lay in formation, as if continuing to hold the line. This was a tragedy that became a symbol of the end of Roman expansion beyond the Rhine. After Teutoburg, the empire never again attempted to advance deeper into Germanic lands. The Rhine River became the new border, not just a line on a map, but a scar that remained in Rome's memory for centuries. Teutoburg changed not only policy but also military strategy. After this catastrophe, the Romans strengthened their defenses and revised the army structure. They no longer relied on local allies so blindly as before. Arminius, a former friend, became a reminder that loyalty couldn't be bought with citizenship. His name became a curse in Roman barracks and a heroic symbol among the Germans. Arminius himself didn't live to old age. Several years later, he perished at the hands of his own tribesmen, who didn't like that he had become too powerful. Thus ended the life of a man who managed to deceive an empire. But his victory remained in history forever, not as a military triumph, but as proof that even the strongest army can drown not in blood, but in its own overconfidence. And over the Teutoburg forest, silence reigned again. Rain washed away the traces of battle. Birds returned to the branches. Only the earth remembered. Under every step slept those who considered themselves invincible. And perhaps in this silence was born Rome's first fear of the north, a fear that would long define its borders and fate. Several years passed before Rome dared to return to the Teutoburg forest. The new commander, Germanicus, nephew of Emperor Tiberius, vowed to avenge the fallen. His army moved cautiously, step by step, as if entering sacred ground. Legionaries carried not only weapons, but also fear, the memory of those who disappeared in this gloomy sea of trees. When they reached the battle site, a terrible picture opened before them. According to Tacitus, bones were scattered everywhere, white skulls protruding from the earth, remains of armor, traces of bonfires. This was not a battlefield, this was a cemetery of legions. Germanicus ordered the fallen buried with full military honors. For the Romans, this was a sacred duty. They collected remains, distinguishing by scraps of plate armor and marks on helmets where whose legions lay. No one spoke aloud, but everyone understood. They were burying not just people, but faith in the empire's infallibility. At the burial sites, they placed stones with inscriptions. These epitaphs would later be found by archaeologists, and from then, it would become clear how deeply this tragedy had cut into the consciousness of the Romans. The forest by that time had changed. Trees had grown taller, thickets covered the paths, but the earth still kept iron and bones. During excavations of the 20th century, archaeologists found coins with Augustus's name, fragments of weapons, and legion insignia. Everything indicated that the battle was fought at several points over a stretch of more than 15 kilometers. These finds confirmed the accounts of ancient historians, showing that Teutoburg was not a single battle, but a series of ambushes stretched across time and space. An important role in these studies was played by data on Roman armament. A legionary of that time wore chainmail armor, lorica hamata, weighing about 10 kilograms, a short sword gladius, a javelin pilum, and a large rectangular shield, scutum. All this equipment gave advantage on open plains where discipline and order decided everything. But in the Teutoburg forest it became a burden. Every step in the sticky mud required colossal effort, and the long spears of the Germans easily struck Romans from above, from behind trees. Germanicus carefully studied enemy positions. He noticed embankments and barriers erected by the Germans in advance. These fortifications, archaeologists would later confirm, remains of wooden walls and ditches, built hastily but with surprising precision. This proved that the ambush was not accidental, but a carefully planned operation. The Germans didn't simply use the forest, they turned it into a weapon. Along with excavations, Germanicus found bodies of Roman officers, recognizable by decorations and swords. Among them were centurions who were killed, probably after the battle. The Germans sacrificed them to their gods. These sacrifices, according to Tacitus's testimony, were part of the victory ritual. For the Germans, this was not just a battle, but sacred retribution for years of humiliation. When everything was finished, Germanicus ordered a mound erected and a memorial rite performed. Soldiers stood silently in the rain, holding helmets in their hands. Their faces were stern, but determination shone in their eyes. From the ashes of defeat, new strength was born. Teutoburg became for Rome not an end, but a reminder that even the most disciplined warriors are powerless before nature and betrayal, but it is precisely the memory of defeat that makes an empire alive. From this moment, Rome changed its attitude towards borders. It fortified forts along the Rhine, built roads, created permanent camps. Germania was no longer considered a target for conquest, but as a wall beyond which another world began. Historians believe that it was Varus's defeat that became the first step toward realization. The empire is not infinite. When Germanicus was leaving the forest, he said to his officers, "They were men, not gods, but today they have become legend." These words became an epitaph to all who died at Teutoburg. And perhaps it was then that Rome first understood that true strength is not in victory, but in the ability to survive defeat and move forward. Decades passed. The Teutoburg forest was no longer simply a geographical place. It became a symbol of the border between civilization and chaos, between order and natural elements. In training camps, legionaries spoke the names of Varus and Arminius in whispers, as a reminder that overconfidence kills faster than a sword. Rome stopped dreaming of endless conquests, and this defeat became the beginning of a new era, an era of fortifications, engineering, and strategic caution. Soon, on the site of former battles, forts arose. Along the entire line of the Rhine and Danube, the Romans built a chain of fortifications known as the limes. This word meant border, but in the Roman understanding, the limes was not a wall, but a living organism, a system of roads, towers, and garrisons connected by signals and discipline. The limes became the empire's answer to Teutoburg. If you cannot defeat the forest, you must restrain it with stone and order. Over the years, the memory of those events turned into legend. The Germans told how the gods sent a storm to wash the Romans into the mud. In their songs, Arminius became a hero, the liberator of Germania. For Rome, he remained forever a traitor. Historians such as Velleius Paterculus wrote about him with contempt, calling him a treacherous barbarian who betrayed his benefactors. But others, including Tacitus, acknowledged Arminius won not by force, but by reason. He turned Rome's knowledge against Rome itself. 20th century archaeology only strengthened the sense of this irony. In the swamps where legions once drowned, remains of roads and bridges were found, built by the hands of the same soldiers whom the earth later swallowed. Even after 2000 years, iron and wood preserved traces of struggle, bent swords, marks of blows, coins welded together by rust. Scientists determined by the composition of metal that some items were forged in Gaul, meaning the legions came from afar to die here, in land they didn't even manage to conquer. The consequences of Teutoburg extended far beyond military history. After this defeat, Emperor Augustus finally abandoned plans to expand the empire northward. From that time on, Rome focused on preserving borders and internal stability. In a strategic sense, this saved the empire from collapse, but spiritually, it dealt a deep wound. For the first time, Romans realized that the world beyond their laws did not submit to their will. Later, in the Middle Ages, this place became overgrown with myths again. It was believed that the souls of legionaries wandered the forest on stormy nights, that their armor rang in the wind. And in the 19th century, when Germany unified, Arminius was elevated to a national hero, and on the hills they built his statue over 50 meters high. Thus history, born in mud and fear, turned into a symbol of pride and freedom. But what remains for us, modern people, in this ancient catastrophe? Perhaps a reminder that strength without caution turns into weakness, that knowledge can become a weapon if there is betrayal in it, and that no system, be it an empire or an army, is protected from human error. When you hear the sound of rain or a footstep on sticky earth, remember those who died here. 30,000 people convinced that their order was stronger than chaos, but chaos proved more patient. And now everyone can ask themselves the question, if you found yourself there, in the fog of the Teutoburg forest, could you take even one more step forward? Or would the earth pull you down too, like those who once considered themselves invincible?